Cold wind howled through the city's streets as a young boy huddled near a subway grate, his thin hoodie barely shielding him from the night's chill. He had learned to stay invisible, to blend into the background of a world that barely noticed him. But tonight would be different. Tonight, he would become the center of a story no one could have predicted. Just a few blocks away, a wealthy woman stepped out of a sleek black car, adjusting her designer coat as she reached for her son's hand. The city was their playground, a place of fine dining and exclusive events. But in a single, heart-stopping moment, her world shattered. Her child, laughing one second, was gone the next, ripped from her grasp and disappearing into the crowded chaos of the streets. Panic surged through her veins as she screamed his name, her cries lost in the noise of the city. Strangers glanced her way but kept walking. No one had seen where he had gone. No one seemed to care. But someone did. Someone who knew these streets better than anyone. From the shadows, the homeless boy had seen everything. And without hesitation, he ran. Faster than he had in a long time. Because he knew where they would take the child. He knew the alleys, the shortcuts, the places people never looked. And he wasn't going to let this story end in tragedy. What he didn't know was that his decision to help would change everything. For the woman. For the child. And for himself. Because when she finally found out who he really was, the truth would shake her to her core. The boy's feet pounded against the pavement, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts as he weaved through the maze of back alleys and side streets. He knew where they would go where people vanished without a trace. He had seen it happen before, and he wasn't about to let it happen again. The woman's child was small, barely more than a toddler, and an easy target. In a city where desperation bred cruelty, children were currency. A young boy with a wealthy mother? He was worth something. The kind of worth that made people disappear forever. The boy's mind raced as he dodged past overflowing dumpsters and rusted fire escapes, his body moving on instinct. He had to get to them before it was too late. Meanwhile, the woman was in a state of complete panic. She had never felt fear like this before, true, paralyzing fear that swallowed her whole. Her perfectly controlled world had shattered in an instant, and she was powerless. She screamed for help, begged strangers to call the police, but the city was indifferent. The people who paused to stare at her didn't know what to do. Then someone spoke. A man, rugged and worn, standing near a bus stop. "You won't find him that way," he said, his voice rough from years of hardship. She turned to him, wild-eyed. "What do you mean?" she demanded, barely able to keep herself together. "The kid," he continued. "The one who ran after them. If anyone can get your son back, it's him." She blinked in confusion. "Who?" The man gave her a knowing look. "A street kid. Smart one. If you went after them, he's your best shot." She didn't know whether to believe him or not, but she had no choice. The boy, meanwhile, had reached his destination. A decaying warehouse near the docks, a place where no one asked questions. He knew the kind of people who worked out of there, and he knew they wouldn't hesitate to hurt him if they caught him sneaking around. Crouching low, he crept along the outer walls, peeking through a broken window. Inside, the child sat in a chair, frightened but unharmed, while two men argued in hushed voices. They hadn't planned on being caught so quickly. They were trying to decide what to do next. The boy had to act fast. But before he could move, a heavy hand clamped down on his shoulder. "Thought I heard something, a voice," sneered behind him. The boy froze. He had been caught. Back in the city, the woman was growing desperate. The police were finally listening, but their questions were slow, their responses sluggish. They weren't moving fast enough. Her son was out there, alone, scared. And the only person who seemed to be doing anything was a child living on the streets. She had to find him. Her search took her to places she had never dared step foot in before. Dark alleyways, shelters where people huddled together for warmth, forgotten corners of the city she had always ignored. With every step, she realized just how little she knew about the world outside her bubble. Finally, she found the man from earlier again. He pointed her in the right direction, but the warning in his eyes was clear. "You might not like what you find," he said. She didn't understand what he meant. But she was about to. Back at the warehouse, the boy was dragged inside, thrown to the ground in front of the two men. They loomed over him, their faces twisted in annoyance. "What do we do with this one?" one of them asked. The boy lifted his chin. He was scared, but he wouldn't show it. "Let the kid go," he said firmly. "He's not worth the trouble." The men laughed, but there was unease in their eyes. They knew who he was. And that's when it became clear he wasn't just any homeless kid. He had a past, a story that had been buried. A secret that, once uncovered, would change everything. The boy's heart pounded as the men exchanged wary glances. They knew who he was. That much was clear. But why did that matter? He was just another kid on the streets, or at least, that's what most people believed. The taller man crouched down, gripping the boy's chin roughly. "Didn't think we'd see you again," he muttered, eyes narrowing. "Figured you were long gone." The boy didn't flinch. He couldn't afford to. "Let the kid go," he repeated, his voice steady. The second man scoffed, rubbing his stubbled jaw. "You got guts, I'll give you that." His gaze flickered toward the younger child, who was trembling in the chair. "But I don't think you're in a position to be making demands." For a long, tense moment, no one spoke. The boy's mind raced, searching for an opening, a way out. He had spent years surviving on these streets, learning how to read people, how to predict their moves before they made them. And right now, he could tell they weren't sure what to do next. They hadn't planned for this. That was his advantage. "If you let him go," the boy said carefully, "I won't say anything. I'll walk away. No trouble." The taller man laughed dryly. "And you expect us to believe that?" "I expect you to think about what happens if you don't," the boy shot back. "You know who I am. Which means you know what happens if people find out what you did." The room went deadly silent. Then, a loud crash. The warehouse door slammed open, and before anyone could react, the woman burst inside. Her eyes were wild, desperate, as she scanned the room, then locked onto her son. "Mommy!" The little boy sobbed. The world seemed to stop. The two men stiffened, caught between fight and flight. They hadn't expected her to find them this fast. And in that split second of hesitation, the street boy acted. With every ounce of strength he had, he lunged at the taller man, knocking him off balance. The other man cursed, reaching for something in his pocket, but before he could react, the woman grabbed a rusted metal pipe from the ground and swung it wildly, forcing them to back away. The little boy scrambled from the chair, running straight into his mother's arms. She clutched him tightly, tears streaking down her face as she whispered frantic reassurances. The street boy knew they had to move fast. "Go!" he shouted, grabbing the woman's wrist. "Now, Al!" She didn't hesitate. Holding her son close, she turned and ran, the boy right behind her. The men shouted after them, but by the time they stumbled through the warehouse doors, the three of them were already gone, disappearing into the maze of alleyways, swallowed by the city. The woman didn't stop running until they reached a busy street. There, under the glow of a flickering street lamp, she finally let herself breathe. She held her son so tightly, it was as if she feared he might vanish if she let go. Then she turned to the boy who had saved him. For the first time, she truly saw him. The dirt on his face. The exhaustion in his eyes. The bruises and scars that spoke of a life she couldn't begin to imagine. "Who are you?" she whispered. The boy looked away, his jaw tightening. "It doesn't matter." Yes, it does. For a moment, he didn't answer. Then, finally, he sighed. "I used to have a home," he admitted. "A family." His voice was quiet, almost hesitant, as if he hadn't spoken those words in years. But something happened. Something bad. She waited, sensing that this was a story he wasn't used to telling. They took everything, he finally said. Left me with nothing. I ran, hid, learned how to survive. He gave a bitter smile. Guess I got too good at it. The woman swallowed, trying to process what she was hearing. This wasn't just some street kid. He had a past. A reason he ended up here. And the way those men had looked at him, it was as if they had unfinished business with him. What do they want from you? She asked carefully. The boy hesitated, then shook his head. You should go home, he said instead. They won't come after your kid again. Not after this. Something about the way he said it sent a chill down her spine. And what about you? He shrugged. I'll be fine. But she wasn't convinced. For the first time in her life, she realized how easy it was to ignore people like him. To walk past them on the street to pretend they didn't exist. But tonight, she couldn't ignore him. Not after what he had done. Come with us, she said suddenly. The boy blinked, caught off guard. What? You saved my son, she said. I can't just leave you here. His instinct was to refuse. He had been alone for so long, depending on no one. Trusting no one. But there was something in her eyes, something real. For the first time in years, someone was offering him a choice. And slowly, hesitantly, he nodded. The days that followed were a blur. The woman kept her word. She took him in, gave him a place to sleep, real food to eat. At first, he kept his guard up, convinced it wouldn't last. But something strange happened. Her son clung to him like a little brother, following him everywhere. The woman never looked at him with pity, only quiet determination. And for the first time in a long time, he felt something unfamiliar. Hope. But the past wasn't done with him yet. One night, as he stood by the window, staring at the city he had once called home, he felt that uneasy feeling of being watched. And when he turned, he saw a shadow lingering outside. They hadn't forgotten him. And they weren't finished with him yet.